Okay, how are we doing today, guys? Today we are talking about the strict or weighted ring dip. Now we're talking about this specifically for building strength, particularly for obviously ring muscle ups or ring exercise variations, as well as towards bar muscle ups, things like that, working on that strict strength. Now this means that the shapes of the body will focus on shapes that are relevant for gymnastics, not specifically around trying to maximize any particular muscle engagement around pecs, triceps, etc. We're trying to focus on movement through the rib cage, movement through the shoulder blades, and maintaining solid structures through the body. Now, we're going to focus on how the video is going to run. Is going to run through your setup, then it's going to run through your movement qualities after that. Now, big thing that we want to get right first is setting up the rings and setting up the positions for you. Now, big mistake we see is people flicking the straps, trying to get them into place. Much easier if you just wiggle them across, particularly if you've got a high ring position. In terms of how wide you want your rings to be, you want them set up so that roughly your knuckles and your elbow are touching in line with those straps or the center of the ring. So I need to go slightly wider. If I stabilize that ring, that's about right for me. And we generally want the center of the ring at about shoulder height. That way, when you're at the top of that, bottom of the rep, I should say, that your feet are clearly off the ground, you're not having to tuck up. That way you can focus on pure full gymnastics shapes and holding your hollow shapes rather than trying to avoid your feet hitting the ground. Now, setup. Obviously, that's how we set the rings up. Two things we want to be working on is your top and your bottom position. Now, the first thing that you want to be thinking about is creating a stack with the hands and the wrist. So when I'm in that top position, or if I'm in the bottom position, you want to be thinking about keeping the wrists stacked directly over the top of that ring. It's going to create a slight inward slant. So you want to be creating a little bit of flexion with that wrist. Main reason for that is that if you sit in an extended position with that wrist, it's much more likely to, one, it's further away from your body, so less stable, but your body weight's going to push that ring away, which makes it significantly harder to balance. So setting yourself up and making sure that you've created that flexion to actually sit over the top of the ring at the top and the bottom of the ring dip itself. From there, we want to be thinking about creating tension. So your top position is going to be creating into a protracted position. You're using your lats and your pecs to pull inwards towards your sides, and you're creating a hollowed shape. So you're thinking about tucking the hips underneath, locking the quads, pointing the toes, pulling the ribs down with the abdominals. And then from there, that's your top position. You're thinking about coming down to your bottom position where the body doesn't change. You'll actually still be hollowed. You'll find that your ribs will sit slightly forwards, your feet will sit slightly backwards, and you're going to be retracted. The elbow is going to be sitting roughly vertical or slightly backwards. And then from there, you're going to be still thinking about stacking that wrist and pulling into your side with your pecs and your lats before driving down. Bottom position is defined as the bicep touching the top of the ring. It's a little bit hard to hold body weight, so you'll see it when I go jump up. So those are your top and your bottom positions. Now, big thing here is to stack. By stack, I also mean balance. So same thing as with all the other gymnastics movements. We want to be thinking about keeping our center of mass, which is roughly about belly button height, maybe a fraction lower. And again, it depends with males, females, and body size, etc. But generally, it's about belly button height, maybe a fraction lower. And you're thinking about creating that hollowed, stacked shape and maintaining that. So what I mean, tucked, quads locked, toes pointed, ribcage pulled down. Now, when I come down to the bottom, that doesn't change. So at the top, it's obviously everything's vertical. As I come down, my ribs need to move forwards to allow for my upper arm to pull back into shoulder extension and to pull back into elbow flexion. But to do that, the ribs have to move forwards, which means I have to counterbalance that. And how I'm going to counterbalance that is by moving my feet backwards, not the hips. What a lot of people do is they'll do this, and they'll push the hip backwards. When you create the hip backwards position, it means that you're not actually lifting your legs, which means it's not actually a strict dip. You're not lifting yourself. You're actually holding yourself up and then using an opening of the joints to drive yourself up, rather than thinking about using just the upper body. So quite important to hold that hollow, and not let the hips bend, not let the knees bend. Otherwise, you're not going to get as strong as what you think. Okay, now moving into the actual movement itself. So you're thinking about creating your hollowed position, your starting shape, protraction, so the shoulder's sitting forwards. From there, knees locked, hips locked. From that point, you're thinking about creating an elbow initiation, which is going to tip you forward slightly. That tipping forwards and the elbow initiation is going to create more space in the front of the shoulder. From there, you're going to be thinking about retracting and pulling that shoulder blade backwards and slightly upwards to allow the elbow to move back into shoulder extension. Body stays the same, and then you reverse that on the way back down, where the elbow initiates that press. From there, the shoulder is going to protract into that forwards position as you're driving through. Ideally, the ring will stay roughly neutral, if not slightly tilted inwards in most cases, along the body. What you don't want to see, though, is the ring sitting out in front or sitting behind. You want to be balanced around that midpoint the entirety through the movement. So, like I said, biceps touch rings to the bottom. Now, there is an exception to that. If you're trying to train specifically for ring muscle ups or things like that, going deeper and training really deep shoulder positions can be advantageous. So that can be something that happens occasionally if you're wanting to work on that specifically. So let's do a demonstration. So obviously you're going to be jumping up into that position. Stack the wrists early, so when I set onto the rings, I'm already stacked. That means I don't have to shift it once I get up there. From there, I'm going to go into that top position. I'm going to drive myself up, create my lockout, create my hollow. Body is stacked and hollowed. As I come down, the elbows initiate. I retract, chest is in front, rings feet are behind. From there, drive myself out and maintain that hollow. That's your ring dip. So, like I said, it can be beneficial to come deeper than that sometimes, but it depends on what your specifics of what you're training and why you're doing that. If you're doing that on a bar, in terms of a dip bar, everything stays the same, just less stability demands put on that. You're also enforced to artificial lengths as well. Now, the other exception to that is obviously a straight bar dip. So I'm just going to grab a stick. Now, a straight bar dip can be a useful thing to train if you're talking about creating positions for a bar muscle up. Now, a bar muscle up, obviously there's reduced range of motion. You can't get as deep in that position. However, you are forced to move around the bar compared to being able to remove through the rings, obviously not having that center point there. So when you're creating a bar dip, everything stays exactly the same. All that you're thinking about is coming down, ribs move forwards, the legs will come out in front of you to maintain that balance around the bar. From there, you'll touch the bottom of the rib cage, and then from there, you'll press and drive out. Everything else stays exactly the same. Cool. I hope you guys enjoyed that. If you have any questions, obviously feel free to ask or shoot us a message. If not, thanks for watching.